This is Report to Wyoming.
The show targets local issues that matter right here in Wyoming, where I talk to real people about their thoughts and ideas. For this episode, I was very fortunate to get to talk to an applied wildlife ecologist and assistant professor in the Department of Zoology and Physiology at the University of Wyoming. However, she does live and teach here in Casper. Her name is Riley F. Bernard. I learned about her through the Wildlife Studies series at the Werner Wildlife Museum. So now I'd just like to emphasize how many cool resources we have here in Casper. If you're somebody who likes to learn, if you have a curious mind, so much going on at the college. Riley and I talk about how she ended up teaching here in Casper, how she got interested in bats, and then, of course, bats themselves. She makes a really good case for why people should be interested in helping the bat population here in Wyoming. And at the end, we talk about some cool cultural bat references.
Yeah, so I went to undergrad at Linfield University and wanted to do a study abroad. And so what I did is I applied to the School for Field Studies and was able to go abroad my senior year in Australia. And so the way that program works is that you're out doing wildlife ecology, going and surveying things, learning about the vegetation and the plants. And at one opportunity, we got to capture bats. And so we set up what's called a harp trap in a corridor, kind of like an old road. And these bats were captured. And one of them that we captured was a female, and she was pregnant. And it was daytime, so we didn't want to release her because bats do have predators. So we kept her in a shoebox throughout the day, and then that night we let her go, but she had given birth to twin pups. So she had these cute little naked babies in the box with her. And the really fun thing about bats is that they have the pups that will cling on to them and hang on as they fly away. So they're moving their babies around from roost to roost. But in this instance, only one pup was able to cling on, and the female flew away. And so I had to babysit this little baby bat and take it to a bat hospital, Tolga Bat Hospital in Queensland. And the little pup didn't survive, but it kind of opened up my world to bats because I realized that I had seen bats growing up, loved going outside, watching them fly around, had them come into my bedroom a couple times. And so it was one of those things where maybe the bats were kind of calling to me to say, hey, let's do some research. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird story, but that's how I got into them.
I love that. So this is a dumb question. Bats are mammals.
They are. Yep.
So they make milk.
They do.
Okay.
Yep. Just like everything else. They have fur. They give birth to live young. They do have milk. The really fascinating thing about bats is that females will give birth to a bat that's about, or a baby that's about a third of their weight. So that's equivalent to a 100-pound woman giving birth to a 30-pound baby in the breech position. So feet first. And then they carry them around until they're able to hang out in the roost by themselves.
Oh, my goodness. So in the wild, twins must be uncommon because it's probably low survivability.
Yes. So most of our bats here in temperate North America, including those within Wyoming, tend to give birth to one pup a year. So they have very low recruitment year after year. Our migratory species, like the hoary bat or the red bat, they're more inclined to have twins. So sometimes you do get twins, but it can be very challenging for the bat, for sure.
Carrying.
Mm-hmm.
Basically their entire body weight. Okay, so the gestation period, is it just that they're only pregnant for a certain duration of the year? What's their seasonality there? Yeah,
so one of the really fascinating things about our North American bats is that most species will engage in what's called swarming in the fall. So this time of year, September, October, maybe a little bit earlier too in some places in the higher latitudes, bats start swarming at their hibernation sites, so where they're going to overwinter. And this swarming period is when they start mating. So they'll mate with, individuals, and then the females have the capacity to overwinter sperm. So they don't become pregnant until the next spring. And and researchers don't quite understand the mechanisms by which they're able to have sperm stay living during that entire 9-month period. Mm-hmm. But if the females come out of hibernation in spring and they're of good body condition, they'll actually then be able to fertilize the egg, become pregnant, and then it's about, I would say, really around 60 days or about 6 weeks or so that they're pregnant. And then they will give birth and then the young, I give about another 60 days that they can't really fly, and then they'll start to become what's called volant. So the babies will be able to start flying on their own, foraging for insects, and then kind of continue on their life cycle. So fall is swarming, winter hibernation, spring and summer, it would be that birth, and then that movement again. Mm-hmm.
And they're nocturnal, so we don't see them very often. People do encounter them, like you said, barns, bedrooms sometimes, but they go unnoticed, don't you think?
Yes, yeah. They would be classified as a cryptic species. So we don't see them all the time, much like, we see mule deer and pronghorn here in Wyoming all the time. Like they're iconic. Bats are cryptic, so we don't see them. They're also, because they're nocturnal, scary. Some people think they're scary. But the reason they're nocturnal is because that's kind of an open niche. Like they have insectivorous birds, or those that eat insects, are active during the day. Then there's no one really active at night. So then you have this whole opportunity to forage for moths and other nocturnal insects. And they have fewer predators, so that's why they stay active at night too. You have some hawks and owls every once in a while that can forage on them. Snakes will eat bats as well, but they kind of have the night sky to themselves for the most part.
So their main source of food is insects.
Mm-hmm.
Do they eat vegetables, or are they omnivorous?
So our species that we have in Wyoming and most of North America, so I'm saying, Canada and the U.S., have insectivorous bats. However, there are some species of bats in Texas and California and some of the southwestern states that are nectivorous, so they are pollinators, so they go after the nectar of agave plants or other cacti. So if you like tequila, you love bats. If you like having, no mosquitoes around or no pests on your ag fields, you love bats. There's also bats that eat fruit, so those are the big flying foxes.
Okay.
Yep, so they tend to eat fruit. We also have some smaller bats that eat fruit, and then we have, of course, the vampire bats. There's three species worldwide, and they are specifically they eat blood. And so there's one species that focuses on mammals, and the two other are more on avifauna or birds. But they're in Central South America, and the cool thing about them is that they don't suck your blood. They have anticoagulant properties in their saliva and antiseptic properties, and so that means the blood just kind of comes out of the wound, and they lick it up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just leave the meat behind?
They do. I mean, they have the capacity that they could drain a chicken, say if there was enough of them drinking on a chicken, but for the most part, they're just doing like every other animal does, trying to survive. And they're really beneficial to human health. You might not think so, but the chemical properties that are in vampire bat saliva has helped create heart medication for humans, and it's the best heart medication out there. The synthetic stuff that we're coming up with in labs is still kind of pales to comparison. So even though they're scary, they're very useful.
And what about the bats here in Wyoming? What do you think is the most prominent?
Like the species? Oh, well, I think the ones that people are going to come most in contact with or see are going to be species like our big brown bats, little brown bats, and probably some hoary bats and silver-haired bats. So we have 20 species now. All the other manuals say we had 18, and the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database, as well as students in my lab, just documented 2 new species to the state. So a little bit of a range expansion in some of that. But yeah, I would say our big brown bats, they love human structures. They're called synanthropic, meaning that they just do very well with our buildings and our bridges and our culverts and things like that. Okay. So most often, big brown bats and little brown bats will be what we see. Some of the bigger bats we see flying in the sky, especially right now around Casper, have been hoary bats, and they're migratory species.
Are these pretty typical, like the bats in a classic horror movie in your attic?
Yeah, I would say they're cuter than that rendition. They.
The ones I'm thinking, they're like leathery and black.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as you can see, I brought some, samples here to show you, and you can see that they're all different colors. They are small brown animals in many respects, but they have, some of them have really big ears, like our Townsend big ear bats. Some are red colored. Some have a darker brown shade. Some have kind of a tricolor look. So they're pretty snazzy and up to date with all the latest trends, I would say, with their coloration.
What do you think as far as evolution? Have you seen, I guess, in a short period, because you're not very old, listeners would know if they could see you, have you seen any changes to the ecology that have impacted bats here in Wyoming?
That's a good question. I would say the thing that we're seeing right now is a change in our community composition of bats and our population of bats here because of a disease called white nose syndrome. So it's a fungal pathogen called Pseudogymnoascus destructans. And that fungus really loves bats when they're hibernating. So it's been first introduced to Howe's Caverns in New York in 2006 and has been moving westward since then. And what we're seeing are that a lot of our bats in Wyoming are dying from this disease or starting to have the effects of morbidity and mortality, meaning they're not surviving hibernation. And one thing that we're seeing in the east in New York, where this disease has been around longest, is that we might be seeing some sort of evolutionary rescue where some populations that were hit really hard are having individuals that are surviving. So there might be some genetic variation in the population. So that's promising. Right now, we're still so early in the invasion that we're just seeing a lot of declines where we're, little brown bats and other species that used to be very, very common are harder and harder to capture and to find out on the landscape.
Now, is this a concern for game and fish, or who's worried about the populations and why?
Yeah, Wyoming Game and Fish Department is very concerned about it. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, all the big players that are stewards of public lands, as well as the wildlife that are on those public lands, are very concerned about the loss of bats. We are seeing a lot of funding that is helping support individuals and students in my lab try to do research to figure out what can we do to increase the likelihood of survival or do something to increase habitat so that the bats that are surviving have a really nice place to go forage and to go rest during the winter. But yeah, Game and Fish has been really working on ways to try to figure out how to minimize declines. And one of those ways is that in collaboration with the U.S. Geological Survey, National Wildlife Health Center, National Park Service, Forest Service, Game and Fish has been initiating a vaccination trial for these bats. So in areas in the Bear Lodge up in the Black Hills on that Forest Service up there, as well as Fort Laramie out in eastern Wyoming, they've been vaccinating bats to try to minimize disease outcomes. And so far, it's very early in the trial. It's been about 2 or 3 years at this point for some of those species or for some of those populations. And we're seeing maybe some successes. But for one species, the northern long-eared bat, the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database has been working with Forest Service and USGS to try to vaccinate northern long-eared bats because we're seeing complete extirpation of the species in many of its areas. So it's been uplisted from threatened to now endangered.
And what's the argument for keeping them around? They're very cute. Again, we're looking at them. But these guys are in the same camp as rodents in some ways. Snakes, people find them scary. But there's probably good reason for these efforts.
Oh, gosh, yeah. I mean, there's been numerous studies that have come out trying to put dollars on the economic importance of bats. And in many of our species that aren't, cute, charismatic megafauna, like something like a panda bear, we have to try to put that dollar sign on the value so that people do care. And like I was saying before, these bats are insectivorous, so they eat insects. Having their presence on the landscape has been estimated to save farmers billions of dollars. Wow. Because then they're not putting out extra money for herbicide and insecticide to try to minimize those impacts. There have been studies by Maine and Boyles, who are some colleagues of mine in Southern Illinois University, that have found that when they've made exclosure plots around corn fields, that when bats can access close by those ears of corn, there's lower disease, there's lower herbivory, and there's better corn kernel output. So just having bats present is a huge boom for us. There was a recent study that just came out in Science magazine, too, that was starting to link that as bats have been declining, we've lost about 6 million estimated due to white nose syndrome, that they're seeing that the lack of bats on the landscape is leading to higher infant mortality due to higher insecticide use. And so this study just came out recently. And, that's pretty telling that having functioning ecosystems, including those bats, those rats, those snakes, and other scary things, are very beneficial not just to our outdoor, ecosystem health, but also to us, too. So having bats around are great. Plus, when they are around, even if they're not directly consuming insects like mosquitoes, they create a landscape of fear for those mosquitoes, and so the mosquitoes kind of hightail it out of there. And so it's good to have them around.
Oh, is there any particular species that's being affected by, you called it white nose?
White nose syndrome, yeah.
Most?
Yes. So of our Wyoming species, we have a lot that are within the genus Myotis, and those Myotis species are getting hit the hardest. There's also another species called Perimyotis subflavus, or a tricolored bat. They have been documented with severe declines as well. And so we are losing a significant number of bats because of this. Some species, like our migratory bats, are not as affected because they migrate out of the area. They also tend to hibernate in thermally unstable areas, like in clumps of tree leaves or in the ground, under clumps of leaves on the bottom of the forest floor. Our Townsend big-eared bats are cave dwellers, but they seem to have different behaviors where they arouse out of hibernation or out of torpor. So they essentially bring their body back up to ambient temperature, from ambient temperature to euthermy, and fly around, forage, and things like that. And they seem to not be affected by it as much. But our Myotis species, a healthy Myotis will go into torpor, reduce that body temperature, that immune system, the metabolism, and kind of be a still animation in a cave in winter. And then they arouse out of that process every 2 weeks or so. And then they will go drink, they'll go to the bathroom, they'll maybe eat a spider off the wall and then engage in that again. So they have perfectly programmed arousal periods to survive from about October all the way through April, May, just like a bear does when it gets ready for hibernation. And so when white nose syndrome, or the fungus that causes the disease, starts infiltrating these bats during hibernation, it's starting to munch away at that tissue, their wing tissue, as well as any other unfurred portions. And then it makes them arouse out of torpor more often. And so then they burn through those fat stores much quickly, and they end up starving to death and or freezing because they're kind of moving out of the cave to get food in a harsh winter like Wyoming.
Right. That's awful.
There's one species of Myotis ciliolabrum, or the western small-footed bat, that seems to be doing okay. We're catching them more often when we're out there netting for bats, but that's at least one hopeful sign that at least one of the Myotis species is doing okay.
When I talked to an ornithologist on this podcast earlier, he mentioned some things that people can do to help out owls and other birds.
Mm-hmm.
What are your prescriptions there?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think, just like with any small animal, house cats are very good at killing bats as well.
So good.
They are fantastic predators. They've done very well for that. But yeah, when we see bats submitted for rabies testing, because a cat or an animal has gotten a hold of them, cats are one of the most predominant ones that bring those bats to a owner, and then the owner submits it for testing just in case, which is always a good thing to do. But cats and smaller dogs, puppies and things that play with things, are good at killing bats. So keeping cats indoors as best you can, or in your yard. Having maybe planting bat-friendly gardens are really good too. So plants that are bringing in nocturnal insects so that bats can forage on those nocturnal insects.
Maybe we should talk about too what types. Does this mean native plant species or?
Yeah, I always say native plant species as best we can, because we want to make sure we're also being good stewards ecologically. But there's a lot of different kind of plants that remain open at dusk that here in Wyoming. I couldn't tell you the species name right now, but but they are, they bring in those pollinators, they bring in those moths, and then that brings the bats. people also put up bat boxes too, bat houses. So that's also something that if they want to have maybe more habitat for bats, that's another way of doing it.
I have never heard of a bat box. I'm
Really?
definitely going to do that because it's like a birdhouse.
Yeah.
But what would we do here?
So here, what we would have is typically you want a multi-chambered bat box. So some of the ones that you can find at some local stores aren't quite the right ones, but there are really good schematics and places you can buy them that are a little bit better for bats. And multi-chambered bat boxes allow for different microclimates in there. So the bats are able to kind of move around when it's too hot or too cold. They have places to roam because we don't want to make it a place that's not hospitable to them. So you have this bat box. You want it to be in the sun. That gets about 6 hours of sun a day, if not a little bit more, painted dark. And typically you want it to be about 13 feet up in the air because while bats are the only mammal that truly flies, they're kind of rubbish at taking off from the ground. So they have to fall first and then get lift. So if you have it about 13 feet up, they have a chance to fall a tad and then be able to take off.
Okay. Oh, I love this. But it's basically just a box, but you're saying so roomy.
Yeah, you can find them online. Like Bat Conservation International has some really good directions on what to look for. And so you can see, and even if you go to places like, Ace or other, gardening places, they'll have bat boxes there. And if you can find one that has 2 chambers kind of on top of each other, that'll be better than just a single chamber box. But yeah, you'll start finding them by the bird food area in some of these stores. Yeah.
I'm 31 and I've never heard of a bat box. But I'm not averse to the idea of them. I'm not scared of bats. I think they're very cool. And then I guess maybe we should lean into that in what you're doing. Have you, had to talk to people about why bats are lovable or how to describe it? Just getting over that fear of bats.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of myths about bats that they're blind, that they like to fly in your hair, that they, are all vampires, things like that, or they all carry rabies, right? So, to get through those, bats aren't blind. They have small eyes. They do use echolocation, and that just kind of helps them see better in a dark atmosphere. It's like turning your high beams on when you're driving through the Shirley Basin, right? Just helps you see a bit more. So bats use that to navigate their world as well as to forage, but they can still see perfectly fine. They don't ever want to fly into our hair. They are very curious. And so because they can echolocate, or at least our species here in Wyoming, they hear high-frequency sounds that we can't hear. And so sometimes if they fly close to you, it could be because there's some sound around you that is emitting some high-frequency noise that they're curious about because they might think it's an insect or something like that. So there's been folks that I've talked to that used to throw pebbles up in the air and bats would come after that. It's because it's the ultrasonic noise that the pebbles are emitting. And then the bats are seeing that, thinking, oh, maybe that's an insect to go after. So they like, pools. If people have pools, that is a place that they will drink water or where insects will be. And so they're going to come down close to take advantage of that resource, but they don't want to go into your hair.
That makes sense because the last time I saw a bat was at the lake at night.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes sense you get those insects making noise, crickets, etc. But we had one that came up pretty close, and I think one of my cousins was fly fishing. And so I don't know if...
Oh, yeah. My husband fly fishes, and he used to fish a ton for bass in Tennessee where he's from, and he used to have bats always coming after the lure when they're trying to get it out there. So it's emitting noise. Yeah.
Okay.
So they're curious about that.
Sparkly?
Mm-hmm.
That totally makes sense. Also, I just had a random thought for our listeners. Stella Luna.
Oh, yes.
That's like then when I think of culture, that's a great representation of a bat.
It is. Stella Luna's fantastic. Frankie the free-tailed bat's another good one.
I have daughters that are very little, so.
Oh, yes, that's a good one. And then I think they have a whole series of like bats in the ball field and like all these different,
bats in the library.
Yes, yeah. So they're all great little, representation of how good bats are for the ecosystem and how they aren't scary. And I think, my little niece, she loves bats now just because she knows her auntie is a bat biologist. But yeah.
How did you get interested in this?
Oh, good question. So I'm from Oregon originally, so went to a small liberal arts school, Linfield, now University. It was college when I was there, so now it's all my swag is now vintage. But Yeah, Linfield was where I got my undergrad. And then after that experience in Australia, I wanted to go to grad school to get into research. So I actually went to school at the University of Hawaii in Hilo. And yeah, it wasn't a rough gig. It was nice to live in Hilo for 3 years. But my research there was looking at the Hawaiian hoary bat, which is an endangered species of bat there. It's the only bat species in the state of Hawaii. And we were looking at dietary overlap between an invasive frog, the coqui frog, and the Hawaiian hoary bat, because the state agency was wanting to know, like, what is the coqui frog doing that could be negatively impacting the native flora and fauna in the state. And so we found that, working with USGS to capture the bats and then collecting hundreds and hundreds of coqui frogs, that the Hawaiian hoary bat and the coqui frog have a diet that overlaps about 22%. So the coqui frog is eating a bunch of the larval forms of the flying insects that the hoary bats need to eat. And in subsequent discussions with some colleagues there, they're finding that as coqui frogs become more established, their calls are so loud that now they're not seeing hoary bats in the Hawaiian hoary bat in the lower elevations. They're kind of being pushed up to higher elevations in Hawaii. So they're being caused to move upward, which could be tied to the coqui frog presence. From there, I moved to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where I did my PH.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology, and that's when I got introduced to working with bats and white nose syndrome, because the first initial part of my project was to look at winter behavior of bats in that region, and then white nose syndrome came through, and so it was kind of a natural experiment that highlighted, what the changes that were going to come and manifest as white nose became established and kind of started killing all these bats off. So that was kind of where I did my education. Then in my field, what you do is a postdoctoral research scientist position. So it's basically like a internship to get used to being a researcher. So I did one on the other side of campus in the wildlife department at Tennessee, working with the National Park Service. And then I moved up to Massachusetts and was affiliated with the U.S. Geological Survey and Pennsylvania State University. And I was working with humans there, mostly decision makers, so wildlife biologists and folks in state and federal agencies, to help them figure out how best to try to make decisions on how to minimize the effects of white nose syndrome and then other diseases on small cryptic fauna that aren't a huge priority in many agencies, because they're not a hook and bullet species. However, they do have to be managed and under non-game. So after that, I came here. I applied for a position and fortunate to get it. Being at the University of Wyoming has been fantastic.
Well, gosh, we are lucky to have you. And so that's kind of cool. Maybe we have a minute. I was just thinking about how your position, you're here in Casper, but you are an employee of the University of Wyoming.
Yep.
So how does that work?
Yeah, so I am full-fledged faculty in the Department of Zoology and Physiology. However, I am stationed here at the branch campus. So if folks don't know, on Casper College campus, there is a station where the University of Wyoming also has a bunch of faculty and departments. So I teach courses within zoology, physiology, and that includes mammalogy. I do teach ornithology, even though I'm not a bird person.
All connects. I don't know what I'm trying to say. It all connects.
It does. And we just hired another faculty member up here. So we have now 2 faculty members that help teach within zoology, which means that we have zoology degrees, we have biology degrees, and we're trying to build up the wildlife fisheries biology and management degree up here too. So we Zoom into our faculty meetings. We often go down to Laramie to meet with our graduate students, because I have a pretty good graduate student team down there. But otherwise, we're here in Casper.
You did your talk at the Werner Wildlife Museum? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's such a cool resource for our community, too, that's maybe underrated. I don't always think about it as much as I should, but now having daughters that are getting older, it's like, wow, we can go there. And the taxidermy is cool, but I think those experiential lessons and the lectures and things that they're offering, that's pretty cool, and people don't always know about them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was my first time giving a talk at the Werner. I brought my ornithology class there last semester, And it was fantastic. The folks there put on a great, system. It's so nice. They have a great rotation of scientists and researchers that come through. And the crowd that I had last week was fantastic. And I had some really great young person questions. They were pretty fun. Yeah.
People were curious.
Oh, very. Yep.
What was, not to put you on the spot, but what was a good question that I didn't ask?
One question was about, what, if you were to eat a bat, what would it be? And I had never been asked that question before, and I highly recommend to not eat bats. Okay. They can carry diseases just like rodents and things like that, and other critters. And I don't think there's really much meat on them, to be completely honest. But some people in other cultures do eat flying foxes and things like that. So it is part of other cultural cuisines. But I myself don't recommend it. As far as if anyone ever offers it to you, just politely decline.
This has been Report to Wyoming, presented in the public interest by Town Square Media.